Jessica Taylor stepped confidently onto Flight 387 from Miami to Chicago, her tailored blazer and sleek demeanor turning heads as she moved through the aisle. Carrying a premium leather bag and a first-class boarding pass, she exuded quiet confidence. Settling into her assigned seat, Jessica began jotting down notes in her notebook, seemingly oblivious to the curious glances from fellow passengers. However, tension crackled as flight attendant Megan Harris approached with a forced smile that didn't mask her underlying unease. "Excuse me, ma'am," Megan said in a polite but sharp tone. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Jessica, unfazed, handed it over, her calm composure unwavering. Megan's frown deepened, and her voice grew colder as she stated, "There seems to be a mistake. This seat isn't appropriate for you." Murmurs filled the cabin as Jessica was asked to leave, her valid first-class ticket ignored, marking the beginning of a shocking confrontation. Their family's strength would be tested like never before. As Jessica Taylor stood in the aisle, holding her leather bag with one hand and her dignity with the other, Megan Harris's piercing gaze bore into her. "I'm going to need you to step aside," Megan demanded, her tone tinged with authority and subtle irritation. Jessica raised an eyebrow, her calm exterior betraying the flicker of disbelief brewing inside. "Is there a specific issue with my seat?" Jessica asked, her voice steady but sharp enough to carry across the cabin. Passengers around them began whispering, the murmur of curiosity and tension rippling through the first-class cabin. Megan crossed her arms tightly, leaning in slightly. "There's been a booking error. I'll need you to move to economy immediately," she stated flatly, avoiding Jessica's piercing gaze. Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line as she adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "This ticket was confirmed weeks ago. If there's been an error, I suggest you double-check your system," she replied, her calm precision cutting through the growing tension. Megan's demeanor shifted as her frustration bubbled to the surface. "I've already checked. Your seat is not appropriate. Either you comply or I'll call security," she snapped, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The atmosphere in the cabin thickened. A few passengers leaned forward in their seats, their eyes darting between Jessica and Megan, as though watching the climax of a live drama. One man whispered to his companion, "What's her deal? That woman clearly belongs here." Jessica took a deep breath, her composure unbroken. "Call whoever you need," she said evenly, "but I'm not moving without a legitimate explanation." Her words carried an unshakable confidence that only added fuel to the growing tension. Without another word, Megan spun on her heel and disappeared toward the galley. Jessica calmly returned to her seat, placing her bag back in the overhead compartment. She sat down, pulling out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen as she typed a message. Moments later, she made a call. "Hello, it's me," Jessica said, her voice low and measured. "We've got a situation, and I'd like it resolved before landing. Keep an eye on the updates, and wait for my signal." She ended the call and placed her phone on the tray table, her expression unreadable but her poise radiating quiet control. Meanwhile, in the galley, Megan paced back and forth, her frustration mounting. She stopped to speak with another flight attendant, Lisa Monroe, a younger woman with a more empathetic demeanor. "That woman doesn't belong in first class," Megan hissed, glancing toward Jessica. "There's something off about her." Lisa raised an eyebrow, sensing the undercurrent of bias but choosing her words carefully. "She has a valid ticket, Megan. Are you sure this is worth escalating?" Lisa asked softly. "She's making a scene. I'm handling it," Megan retorted, her tone clipped. Back in first class, Jessica sat calmly, her hands resting on the armrests. Though her exterior seemed unshaken, the wheels were turning in her mind. Across the aisle, a man leaned toward her. "You doing okay?" "This doesn't seem fair," he whispered. Jessica offered a small, reassuring smile. "I'll be fine. Thank you for asking," she replied. Minutes later, Megan returned, this time with Dennis, the senior flight attendant. His calm but firm demeanor starkly contrasted Megan's escalating frustration. Megan gestured toward Jessica's seat. "This passenger needs to move. I've already explained the situation," she said, her voice lacking the confidence it had earlier. Dennis frowned, glancing at Jessica. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" he asked politely. Jessica handed it over without hesitation. Dennis examined it carefully, his brow furrowing. "This ticket is valid and it's for this seat," he said matter-of-factly, handing it back to Jessica. "I see no reason for her to move." Megan's face flushed. "It's a mistake. She doesn't belong here," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. Dennis's eyes narrowed. "Megan, we don't make judgments like that. She's staying in her assigned seat." He turned to Jessica. "I apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am. Please don't hesitate to let me know if there's anything you need." Jessica nodded politely. "Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate your professionalism." As Dennis walked away, Megan stood frozen, her face betraying the internal storm raging inside her. She turned on her heel and stormed off toward the galley, her mind racing. Jessica, meanwhile, sat back in her seat and opened her notebook. She began jotting down notes, her movements deliberate and calm. Passengers nearby exchanged glances, clearly sensing the power shift in the room. Megan's earlier hostility now seemed reckless, a stark contrast to Jessica's unwavering composure. As the flight continued, Jessica's phone buzzed on the tray table. She glanced at the screen, her expression unreadable, and typed a quick response before tucking it away. Megan avoided looking in her direction for the remainder of the flight, though the tension in the cabin was palpable. By the time the captain's voice announced the plane's descent into Chicago, Megan felt like she was walking on eggshells. Jessica, however, remained composed, her calm demeanor a sharp reminder of who held control. Megan's unease grew as she realized this was far from over. What had started as a confrontation about a seat had now spiraled into something much bigger, something Megan could no longer control. As Flight 387 neared its descent into Chicago, the cabin hummed, with the quiet tension left in the wake of the confrontation between Jessica Taylor and Megan Harris. While most passengers tried to return to their books or movies, a few couldn't help but steal glances at Jessica, whose calm composure remained unshaken. Megan, however, was a stark contrast. Her once confident demeanor had crumbled under the weight of her miscalculation, leaving her movements stiff and her expression pale. In the galley, Dennis was addressing Megan again, his tone firmer than before. "You need to understand what's happening here, Megan. This isn't just about you or her anymore. The executive office has eyes on this flight, and you're at the center of their scrutiny." Megan gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she muttered, her voice trembling. "I thought I was following protocol." Dennis sighed heavily, crossing his arms. "You weren't following protocol, you were following assumptions. And now we're all cleaning up the mess." Meanwhile, Jessica glanced down at her phone as it vibrated with another message. She opened it discreetly, her lips curling into a faint smile before typing a brief reply. Sliding the phone back into her bag, she looked out the window at the cityscape below, her sharp gaze betraying her anticipation. She knew the storm brewing was about to reach its climax, and she was fully prepared for it. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in the upright position. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival." Megan's heart pounded as she moved through the first-class cabin, checking seatbelts and tray tables with robotic precision. Every step felt heavier, each glance toward Jessica a reminder of her growing dread. She avoided making eye contact with her, but the weight of Jessica's calm confidence seemed to follow her like a shadow. When the plane finally touched down, passengers began to shuffle in their seats, unbuckling seatbelts and reaching for their bags. Jessica, however, remained seated, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She pulled her phone out one last time, typing a message that read, "We've landed. Be ready." As the cabin doors opened and passengers began to disembark, Megan lingered near the exit, her forced smile cracking under the pressure. When Jessica finally rose, her tall figure commanding quiet attention, Megan straightened up, her trembling hands betraying her nerves. "Thank you for flying with us, Miss Taylor," Megan managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica met her gaze, her eyes sharp and steady. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," she replied smoothly before stepping off the plane. Megan stood frozen, watching Jessica disappear into the jet bridge. A few moments later, Two uniformed airline representatives stepped onto the plane. They glanced around before addressing Dennis. "We're here for Megan Harris," one of them said. Dennis's expression darkened as he turned to Megan, who visibly paled. Her legs felt like lead as she followed the representatives off the plane, leaving behind the echoes of her mistakes and a cabin full of passengers who would never forget what they had witnessed. As Jessica Taylor stepped into the bustling terminal at O'Hare International Airport, she moved with the same quiet composure she had displayed throughout the ordeal. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced down to read the message. "Representatives are handling the situation. Full report to follow." A faint smile flickered across her lips. She slid the phone back into her sleek leather bag and walked toward baggage claim, her every step measured, her purpose unshaken. Back on the plane, Megan Harris sat in a sterile conference room near the gate, flanked by two stern airline representatives. The once confident flight attendant now appeared small, her uniform feeling tighter with every passing moment. The lead representative, a middle-aged man with a clipboard, spoke in a tone that brooked no argument. "Miss Harris, the executive office has received a formal complaint regarding your conduct during Flight 387. Given the seriousness of the allegations, we are required to conduct an immediate review." Megan's voice wavered as she attempted to defend herself. I didn't mean to single her out. It was just protocol. I thought—" The man held up a hand, silencing her. "Miss Taylor is a priority passenger and a shareholder with significant ties to the airline. Her complaint has escalated directly to the board. What you thought is irrelevant. Your actions put the company at risk of reputational and legal repercussions." The words hit Megan like a gut punch. Her heart sank as she realized the depth of her mistake. "I didn't know," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "If I had, I never would have—" "That's the problem," the representative cut in sharply. "You acted without cause or verification, and now the airline is left to clean up your mess. You've been placed on immediate suspension pending further investigation." Meanwhile, Jessica's driver pulled up in a sleek black sedan, stepping out to open the door for her. "Miss Taylor," he greeted her with a respectful nod. "Everything has been arranged." Jessica slid into the back seat gracefully. As the car began its journey into downtown Chicago, her phone buzzed again. The email was from the airline's CEO, Richard Hale, requesting a personal meeting to discuss the incident and the reforms she had demanded. Jessica typed a quick response. "I'll make time tomorrow. Let's ensure this doesn't happen again." While Jessica prepared for her next steps, Megan was escorted out of the terminal through a side exit, her face pale and her expression haunted. The realization that her snap judgment had cost her more than she ever anticipated was beginning to sink in. Her career, her reputation, and the trust of her colleagues were now hanging by a thread. As Jessica's car pulled into the heart of the city, she leaned back in her seat, reflecting on the day's events. The incident had been humiliating, but it had also revealed the cracks in a system that allowed such bias to thrive. For Jessica, the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. She wasn't interested in revenge. Her goal was clear: accountability, reform, and ensuring no one else would endure what she had. By the time Megan reached her small apartment that evening, she sat in silence, staring blankly at her suspension notice. The weight of her actions pressed down on her like an anchor. She replayed every choice she had made on that flight, each one now glaring in its error. Deep down, she knew that she had underestimated Jessica Taylor, a mistake that had cost her dearly. Jessica, however, felt no vindication in Megan's downfall. As she prepared for her meeting with the CEO, she focused on the broader picture: implementing systemic change. She had turned a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for progress, and she wasn't about to let that momentum fade. For Jessica, this was no longer about a single flight. It was about changing the skies for everyone. The next morning, Jessica Taylor arrived at the airline's corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago, a sleek glass tower that exuded authority. Clad in a tailored navy suit, she carried herself with the same unshakable poise that had silenced an entire first-class cabin. As she entered the building, her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant. "The board is expecting you in conference room 7. Everything is set." Jessica replied with a quick "thank you" before stepping into the elevator. In the conference room, Richard Hale, the airline's CEO, stood by the window, his sharp silhouette framed against the city skyline. Around the table sat senior executives and legal advisors, their faces tense with anticipation. When Jessica entered, the room seemed to shift. She offered a polite smile but wasted no time with pleasantries. "Thank you for meeting with me," Jessica began, taking her seat. "I trust you understand the gravity of the situation." Richard nodded, his expression measured. "Miss Taylor, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you experienced on Flight 387. It was unacceptable and does not reflect the values of our airline." Jessica's eyes didn't waver. "An apology is a start, but I'm here to ensure this doesn't happen again. Not to me, and not to anyone else. What happened wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of systemic issues within your organization." Her words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Richard glanced at his colleagues before responding. "We've already initiated a full review of our policies and procedures. Sensitivity and bias training for all employees is being implemented immediately, and the incident involving Miss Harris is under investigation." Jessica nodded slightly, but her tone remained firm. "I want more than reactive measures. This incident revealed a culture that tolerates bias. That needs to change at every level. I'll be expecting a detailed plan with timelines for these reforms, as well as regular progress reports." Richard leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "You have my word. We're committed to making this right." Meanwhile, Megan Harris sat in another conference room on a lower floor, awaiting her disciplinary hearing. The sterile atmosphere and the weight of her suspension notice made the walls feel like they were closing in. A panel of senior HR representatives entered, their expressions unreadable but serious. "Megan Harris," one began, flipping through a file. "We're here to address the complaint filed against you by Jessica Taylor, a shareholder and priority passenger. You've been accused of misconduct stemming from biased decision-making on Flight 387. Megan swallowed hard, her palms damp. "I didn't mean for it to escalate. I thought," she began, but the lead representative cut her off. "You assumed," he said sharply. "And in doing so, you jeopardized the airline's reputation and trust with one of our most important stakeholders." Megan's attempts at justification faltered under the weight of their scrutiny. Every decision she had made during that flight played back in her mind, and for the first time, she felt the crushing reality of her mistake. Upstairs, Jessica concluded her meeting with the board. As she rose to leave, Richard extended his hand. "Thank you for holding us accountable," he said. Jessica shook his hand firmly. "I'll be watching," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. As Jessica exited the building, Megan walked out the side entrance, clutching a termination notice in her hand. The gravity of her actions had finally caught up to her. Stripped of her uniform, she was no longer the confident flight attendant she had once been. Instead, she was left with the bitter realization of how her prejudice had unraveled her career. Jessica, stepping into her awaiting car, felt no satisfaction in Megan's downfall. Instead, she focused on the broader victory, the reforms that would come from this incident. Looking out at the bustling city, she thought of all the passengers who would benefit from a fairer, more accountable airline. Her fight was far from over, but she had taken the first step in reshaping the system, one flight at a time. Weeks after the incident on Flight 387, the airline began rolling out sweeping reforms. New policies on bias training and accountability were implemented across all departments, with every employee, from ground crew to executives, required to participate. Jessica Taylor's name was now synonymous with progress, though she remained out of the spotlight, focused on ensuring the reforms weren't just symbolic gestures. At the same time, Megan Harris faced a new reality. Having lost her job, she began working with a nonprofit focused on workplace equity, using her mistakes as a case study to educate others. Though the experience humbled her, it was a long road toward redemption. Jessica, boarding another flight weeks later, noticed subtle but meaningful changes in the crew's behavior. The staff were more attentive and respectful, treating every passenger with dignity. As she took her seat, she smiled slightly. It wasn't perfection, but it was a step toward lasting change. In 2025, Jessica Taylor's story serves as a reminder of the importance of accountability and systemic reform in addressing bias. It highlights the power of individual resilience and strategic action in driving meaningful change. Through Jessica's determination, an airline overhauled its training programs, fostering a culture of inclusivity and respect. This reflects a broader societal shift where institutions are being held to higher standards of fairness. Her story teaches us that standing up against prejudice, even in personal battles, can create ripples of progress that benefit everyone, emphasizing that change begins with courage but is sustained through persistence and accountability. Jessica Taylor's story inspires us to stand against bias and demand accountability. Now it's your turn to make a difference. Share this story to raise awareness about the importance of fairness and inclusivity in everyday interactions. Leave a comment below to show your support for Jessica's efforts and suggest how she can continue to push for systemic reforms, not just in the airline industry but across other sectors. Together, we can amplify her message and ensure her actions spark lasting change. Let's stand with Jessica and advocate for a world where dignity and respect are universal rights.